Hi everyone. I know my name's come up a couple times during the day, so I thought the best thing to do was just give you a bit of context of who I am and what I do. As was just alluded to, I don't have a background in journalism. I came to NPR from the internet policy world. After I finished university, I was involved in working on education and technology policy in the U.S., getting computers and internet access in U.S. classrooms, and later ran this nonprofit social network called the Digital Divide Network, which focused on internet policy around the world, bringing media literacy to communities that didn't have it, online freedom of speech, et cetera. And throughout all that, I always relied on the communities I participated in online to tackle whatever job I was working on at the time. I discovered very early on that I really don't know much about these subjects, and I can't pretend to be an expert on any of them, whereas there are plenty of people online who do have expertise in one form or another. And so throughout my career, I've organized online communities, everything related from email lists to Facebook pages to the community that's coalesced around my Twitter account, to basically ask questions of that community and sort out what's true and what's not. So essentially, when people describe my Twitter account as a one-man news feed, I always push back and say, no, it's not a news feed. It's an open newsroom coordinated by one person. I'm the public output for what the group is doing, but there are meanwhile thousands of people who follow me on Twitter who bring their expertise to the table and help me cover whatever I happen to be working on. So because of the work I used to do related to internet policy, I'd gotten to know a number of Arab bloggers over the years and traveled to Tunisia on a few occasions, both to work there as well as to travel around and get harassed somewhat by the security apparatus because they weren't too thrilled with what I was blogging about the country and its government at the time. And so when the first Tunisian bloggers started to use the Sidi Bouzid hashtag a couple of days after Mohamed Bouazizi set himself on fire, it started circulating on Twitter. And when I saw it, I didn't know what it represented. I mean, I figured it was the name of a town somewhere, but it took me just a little bit of time to figure out what was happening. And by the Christmas holidays, so between Christmas and New Year's, I started tweeting about what was happening and posed to my Twitter followers, are we seeing the beginning of what might be called a Jasmine Revolution? And no one replied because no one knew what the hell I was talking about. No one in the US generally knew anything about Tunisia except perhaps some sci-fi nerds who knew that Star Wars films were filmed in the southern part of the country. But that was really about it. So as I started trying to sort out what was going on the ground, I began asking my Twitter followers to help me out because I don't speak Arabic. And my French is terrible as well. And so there was only so much I could figure out as user-created materials started coming across Twitter. And so people would volunteer to translate different things for me. And as they did that, I began to understand where they were from and what dialects they spoke. And so as the Tunisian revolution morphed into the Egyptian one, and then after that, Bahrain, Yemen, Libya especially, and then later Syria, more and more people began to coalesce around my Twitter account willing to help me out. So for example, in the days, at the early days of the Libyan revolution, they had been circulating the date Feb 17 as the launch date. They started circulating that a couple weeks early. And some of the protesters were so eager to get the revolution started, they started early. And so the first videos started to appear on February 15th and 16th. And a lot of news organizations didn't want to touch this footage because there was no easy way to confirm that these were filmed in Libya, because there weren't any reporters in Libya. There weren't many reporters who had experience in Libya. So rather than passing judgment on them myself, I would share these videos with my Twitter followers and say, tell me what you see and what you hear. And people would take a look at them and they'd say, well, I remember visiting Benghazi as a teenager, and that's the courthouse. You can look at it on Google Earth and you can see the pictures a match. Or they might say, I'm from Egypt, and I speak a variety of dialects, and I recognize that it's definitely an Eastern Libyan dialect, and not from Tripoli. It's got to be around Benghazi or Derna. Others would then come out and say, well, if you look at the timestamp on the video and listen to that call to prayer that's starting in the background, match that to the schedule of when the sunset call to prayer is supposed to start, it's an exact match. And so all these different techniques that wouldn't have occurred to me personally, people came up with on their own and shared them with me so we could begin sorting out this information. And so over the course of basically more than 18 months, NPR cleared my plate and basically said, whatever you thought your job was before, just don't bother. Which was good, because I had been ignoring my job for about 2 months at this point. I'd been blocking out, I'd go into my calendar and I'd block out days at a time saying that I was in meetings so people wouldn't bother me, so I could be talking to Syrians on Skype instead, or Libyans. And then when they finally figured out, one of our executives came over to my desk and sort of wrapped his fingers somewhat derisively on the top of my cubicle. And he leaned over and said, I don't understand what you're doing, but please keep doing it. And with that, I suddenly became NPR's guy on social media for all things Arab Spring. And so over the next 18 months or so, and still honestly continuing to this day, I've done a variety of projects with my Twitter followers. In some cases, it's focused on debunking rumors. So at one point, some of the regional news networks, such as Press TV and Al Jazeera Arabic, were reporting that there was evidence Israel had supplied weapons to Gaddafi, which made little sense given that they were arch enemies, essentially. But nonetheless, conspiracy theories are a spectator sport in Libya, so it wasn't a huge surprise that it was spreading around. And the evidence that they were using was a photo of a rebel holding a fairly large mortar shell, or an artillery shell, and it had a 6-pointed star on it. And so they said, Star of David, that's got to be from Israel. And so I tweeted, well, hang on a second. If I'm the Israelis and I want to covertly supply weapons to Gaddafi, for whatever reason, would I put a national symbol on it? Probably not. And so I asked my Twitter followers, search databases, go take a look at websites that focus on arms manufacturing, do whatever it is you think you can figure out, and get back to me. And within an hour or so, we debunked it. It turns out that this particular symbol, in combination with a few others, are used to mark what are known as star shells or illumination rounds. So these are mortars and artillery shells that are launched up at the middle of the night, and they have some sort of chemical inside that lights up the sky and allows them to see what's going on the ground. And we found evidence of this symbol being used on shells going all the way back to World War I. We found schematics from the UK of cross-sections of shells and the symbols that were on them. Eventually, we found a declassified NATO manual that showed all the symbols that could be allowed to signify certain things. And there it was on page 28 or whatever, the so-called Star of David. But in reality, it was just a 6-pointed star. And nonetheless, some of these networks ran with the story for several weeks, even though we were sitting on evidence that clearly showed it wasn't true. In other cases, we've spent time trying to engage with citizen journalists on the ground who would be live streaming from different places, especially Syria. One of the first live streamers I met, he was based in Libya and was also one of the first casualties among the citizen journalism community. He was killed in the morning that the NATO intervention started. But his methodology and model got picked up by Syrians and people in other parts of the region, and suddenly there was this blossoming of dozens and dozens of live streamers and YouTube accounts across Syria, and unfortunately these people started dying like flies. One after another would be killed in an incident, and someone would then literally pick up the banner and their camera and keep filming. And so one of my jobs was to follow all these networks and to figure out who was related to whom, because it wasn't unusual that if a particular cameraman was killed, a brother-in-law or a first cousin might be the one to take over that network. And that happened again and again, and we were able to keep up with that traffic as it moved on. Then there were other cases that bordered on the ludicrous. How many of you are familiar with the story of Gay Girl in Damascus? Oh, yeah. Okay, good, not many of you. So one of the more prominent bloggers in the early days of the Syrian Revolution was a woman named Amina Araf. And she was a Syrian-American woman who had moved back to Syria late the previous year, I believe, or earlier that year. And she started blogging about what it was like being a gay woman in Damascus, which is complicated enough when you're not having a revolution. But she became a fairly big deal in the first couple of months. She got a lot of press. The Guardian sent someone in to interview her in Damascus, and other news organizations interviewed her virtually, through, just texting each other or whatever. And then one day in June of 2011, she was kidnapped. A cousin of hers reported on her blog that 2 or 3 men grabbed her in front of her apartment, and they had no idea where she was. And so supporters of her and people who had known her online for a long time began organizing protests, setting up Facebook pages, marching in front of Syrian embassies in different places. And I was fascinated by the story because I always thought, she was an interesting character. She was, I thought her writing was a bit overblown at times, but people seemed to like her work. So I started asking around among her friends what they could tell me about her. And I quickly discovered that she had a very strong social network online, like people who had known her for a very long time, been friends with her for a long time on Facebook and elsewhere. Yet none of them had met her in person, which seemed odd. So I started asking my Twitter contacts who were in Syria, including several members of the local gay community there. And they got back to me and said, yeah, we hear that she's attended meetings of the local Revolutionary Committee, but we don't know who's met her either. And so I started asking publicly, do you know anyone who knows her or have friends of friends that have met her in person? And a number of her friends quickly attacked me and were saying, how dare you challenge her veracity when we need to be focusing on her release right now? And I said, I'm making no judgment calls right now. I just want to find out who this person is and what their story is. But the deeper we dug, the stranger it got. We started seeing that when she had blogged on certain sites, the IP address traced to Edinburgh rather than anywhere in Damascus. Photos that she used on her Facebook page were traced to a Croatian woman living in London. And so it either meant one of several things. One, that she was possibly still very deep in the closet and scared for her safety, quite understandably, and had set up this persona online to protect herself. The next theory, which is a bit more nefarious, was that she was an agent of the Mukhabarat or Mossad or CIA or pick your intelligence agency, and that she had infiltrated gay organizations online because they were closely associated with the activist and revolutionary community as well. Then there was the possibility it was a flat-out hoax, but if that had been true, she had been getting away with it for years. And as we dug further and further and started piecing it together, we eventually discovered that Amina Araf was a guy named Tom McMaster. And he was an American from Georgia who was studying Byzantine history at the University of Edinburgh. And he denied it at first, but we ended up finding photos on his wife's Picasa page, her photo gallery page, that matched photos that she had sent to Amina's online girlfriend. Yes, this character even had a girlfriend online. And not only did they match perfectly, we discovered that the ones that the girlfriend had received were the originals, with the original metadata, and no one would have access to that except the person who took it. And these were on his wife's page on her trip to Damascus. So eventually he confessed, and all of a sudden the debate switched to how can we ever trust a blogger from the Arab region again? And unfortunately this became something that the bloggers themselves were saying. One of my contacts there, a blogger who I've actually met in person, so I can confirm he's real, he posted, what on earth will happen if I'm ever picked up by the secret police and disappear? If my family talks about it on Facebook and Twitter, will anyone try to help me, or are they going to debate whether or not I'm another Amina Araf? And so these are just a few examples of the types of things I've been doing online. Everything from that to looking at all the evidence of chemical weapons going back over the last year. My Twitter followers dive into these things not because they have a vested interest in NPR, necessarily. Many of them have never even heard of NPR. I think the reason why they do this is because they've come to see me as someone online who's taking these stories seriously, but is also willing to admit when he doesn't know what he's talking about. And so these people, whether they are an expert in the traditional sense that they have certifications in PhDs or the like, or they have cultural experience because they grew up in certain parts of the world, they come out of the woodwork and offer their assistance because they know if enough of them do this, eventually there's going to be a critical mass of people that will allow us to at least get to the grain of the truth, if not the complete picture. And so that's basically how I work.